The sound of the spit hitting the floor was louder than it should have been. For a moment, the entire diner went silent. The elderly waitress froze in place, her wrinkled hands still holding a tray of coffee cups. The teenage boy sitting in the booth leaned back in his seat with a smirk, as if he had just performed a joke meant for everyone in the room. What he didn't realize was that several men sitting quietly in the corner had been watching everything. And those men were bikers. Before we begin this emotional story, take a second to like the video, share it with someone who believes kindness still matters, and subscribe to the channel. If you believe people deserve second chances and that respect for others should never disappear, drop a comment below as well. Your support helps stories like this reach more hearts. The diner sat just off a quiet highway outside a small town, the kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee and travelers stretched their legs before long drives. It was old but warm, with red vinyl booths, the smell of fresh pancakes in the air, and a faded sign above the counter that read, "Welcome home." For 43 years, Margaret Wilson had worked there. She was 73 now, her back slightly bent, her hair thin and silver. Her uniform had been washed so many times the blue fabric had softened into something almost gray. Despite the aches in her knees and the tiredness in her eyes, Margaret still greeted every customer with the same gentle smile. Most people who came to the diner knew her. Truck drivers called her Mama Margaret. Local families trusted her with their children. She remembered birthdays, favorite meals, and stories from decades ago. But that afternoon, the people sitting in booth number 6 didn't know her at all. 3 teenagers had walked in just after lunch hour. Their clothes were expensive, their watches gleaming, their voices loud enough to turn heads. One of them, a tall boy with perfectly styled hair and a designer jacket, clearly believed the world existed for his entertainment. His name was Ethan Caldwell. His father owned half the businesses in the nearby city. Hotels, real estate, restaurants. People said the Caldwell family had money older than the town itself. And Ethan had grown up knowing it. Margaret approached their table slowly, her tray balanced on one hand. She smiled kindly and asked what they'd like to order. The boys barely looked at her. One of them snorted at the way her hands trembled slightly as she wrote down their meals. Another whispered something that made them laugh. Margaret pretended not to notice. Years of working with all kinds of people had taught her patience. Some customers came in angry. Some came in cruel. She had learned not to take it personally. But Ethan seemed determined to push things further. When their food arrived, he complained that his burger wasn't hot enough. When Margaret brought another one, he said the fries were too salty. When she refilled their drinks, he rolled his eyes at how slow she moved. Still, Margaret apologized politely each time. What Ethan didn't notice was the table in the far corner. 5 men sat there wearing leather jackets covered with patches. Their motorcycles were parked outside, massive chrome machines glinting under the sun. They were members of a local motorcycle club known as the Iron Guardians. Despite their intimidating appearance, the town knew them differently. They organized charity rides, raised money for hospitals, and escorted bullied children to school to protect them. The man sitting closest to the window was their leader. His name was Jack Hawk Turner. He had broad shoulders, gray streaks in his beard, and eyes that had seen enough of life to recognize cruelty instantly. And right now, Hawk was watching Ethan. Margaret returned to the table one last time to ask if they needed anything else. Ethan leaned back in his booth and stared at her with a look of bored amusement. Something about the quiet kindness in her face irritated him. Without warning, he leaned forward and spit onto the floor beside her shoe. The sound echoed in the silent diner. Margaret froze. Her tray trembled slightly as she stared down at the floor. For a moment, nobody moved. The other customers looked away awkwardly. The teenage boys at the booth burst into laughter. Margaret slowly bent down with a napkin to clean the floor. Her hands shook more than before. It wasn't just the insult. It was the humiliation. 43 years of serving people with dignity, and now this. But before she could finish wiping the floor, a chair scraped loudly across the diner tiles. Every head turned. Hawk stood up. The other bikers followed him without a word. They walked slowly across the diner, their heavy boots echoing with each step. Suddenly, the laughter at Ethan's table faded. Hawk stopped beside the booth. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at Ethan with a calm expression that carried more weight than anger ever could. The teenage boy shifted in his seat. Confidence drained from his face. Hawk glanced down at Margaret, who was still kneeling on the floor. Gently, he reached out and helped her stand up. Then he picked up the napkin from her trembling hands. Without saying anything, he finished wiping the spot on the floor himself. The entire diner watched in stunned silence. When Hawk finally turned back to Ethan, the room felt heavy with tension. But instead of yelling, Hawk spoke quietly. Not the kind of quiet that comes from fear. The kind that comes from disappointment. He explained something Ethan had probably never considered before. He told him that the woman he had just humiliated had worked in that diner longer than Ethan had been alive. She had served thousands of meals to tired travelers. She had comforted grieving families, celebrated birthdays with strangers, and stayed late countless nights just to make sure people felt welcome. He told Ethan that respect had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with character. And right now, Ethan had shown none. The words hit harder than any threat could have. Ethan's friends stared down at the table. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt something unfamiliar creeping into his chest. Shame. Hawk reached into his jacket and placed a thick stack of cash on the table. Not as a tip, but as a reminder. He told Ethan that money could pay for meals, but it could never buy dignity. Then he asked Ethan to do something much harder than writing a check. He asked him to apologize. The diner remained completely silent. Ethan's face turned red. For a moment, pride battled with the realization that dozens of people were watching him. Finally, he stood up. His voice was barely audible as he apologized to Margaret. The elderly waitress looked surprised. Then something remarkable happened. She smiled. Not a triumphant smile. Not a bitter one. A gentle, forgiving smile. Because Margaret had lived long enough to understand that sometimes people needed a moment to realize who they were becoming. The bikers returned to their table. The tension slowly dissolved. Conversations resumed. But something inside Ethan had shifted. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped lower over the highway, Ethan walked back into the diner alone. Margaret was wiping the counter. When she saw him, she looked curious but not angry. This time, Ethan spoke without hesitation. He told her the truth. He admitted that he had grown up surrounded by wealth but not by humility. People had always excused his behavior. Because of his last name. Until today. Until a group of strangers cared enough to show him what respect actually looked like. Margaret listened quietly. Then she placed a warm cup of coffee in front of him. Not because he deserved it, but because kindness had always been her way of changing the world. Weeks later, something unexpected began happening. Ethan started volunteering at the diner on weekends. At first, people assumed it was punishment from his parents. But it wasn't. He simply wanted to learn something money had never taught him. Hard work, humility, and respect. He washed dishes, cleaned tables, carried heavy boxes into the kitchen. Margaret taught him small things, how to greet customers warmly, how to remember regulars, how to treat every person who walked through the door as if they mattered. The bikers returned occasionally, watching quietly from their corner booth. Hawk never mentioned the incident again. He didn't need to. The lesson had already taken root. Months later, the diner celebrated Margaret's retirement. The small building was filled with people whose lives she had touched over 4 decades. Truck drivers, families, locals, and one young man standing proudly beside her. Ethan Caldwell. He helped organize the entire celebration. When Margaret gave a short speech, her voice trembled slightly with emotion. She said something simple that everyone in the room would remember for years. Kindness costs nothing, but it can change everything. And sometimes, the people who look the toughest, are the ones who remind us of that truth. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who believes kindness still matters, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind us of the good still left in the world. And before we finish, here's a special request for you. Comment the word, respect, below if you believe every person, no matter their job, age, or background, deserves to be treated with dignity. Because the truth is, you never know who might be watching. And sometimes, the smallest moment of cruelty can become the beginning of a powerful change. If this story moved you even a little, please engage with the video by liking, commenting, and sharing it with others. Your support helps spread messages of kindness, empathy, and second chances to people who may need them the most. And remember, True strength is not shown in power or wealth. It's shown in how we treat the people who can offer us nothing in return.